In the glittering world of Manhattan's elite, billionaire Marcus Stanton reigns supreme. Cold, calculating, and indifferent to those beneath him, he thrives on power. But when a chance encounter with a young homeless woman, Emily Tanner, leads to a public humiliation, Marcus unwittingly sets off a chain of events that will unravel the carefully constructed empire he controls. Emily, cast aside and broken, disappears into the shadows of the city. But her story catches the attention of investigative journalist Claire Holden, whose pursuit of truth uncovers a shocking revelation. Emily is Marcus's niece, the daughter of his long-lost brother, Jonathan Stanton, who mysteriously vanished decades ago. As buried family secrets emerge, Marcus is forced to confront a past filled with betrayal, guilt, and loss. Caught between a desire for revenge and a hope for reconciliation, Emily, Claire, and Marcus are thrust into a battle for redemption. In a world where wealth and power have defined their lives, they must face the question: can one truly change, or are they forever bound by the sins of their past? The answers lie in a harrowing journey of forgiveness, justice, and the high cost of humility. The grand ballroom glittered with gold and crystal, a sea of evening gowns and tailored suits swirling beneath the glow of the chandeliers. Marcus Stanton, standing near the center of it all, raised a glass of champagne to his lips, though he barely tasted it. This was his world, luxurious, powerful, and perfectly under control. "Marcus, you must meet Senator Brown," an associate called out, waving him over. Marcus smiled, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room as he moved effortlessly through the crowd. He had spent years perfecting the art of this dance, mingling with the powerful, ensuring his position as one of the city's elite. Wealth, power, influence. It all surrounded him like a protective bubble, but underneath, there was an emptiness he couldn't shake. The senator greeted him with a firm handshake. "Marcus, good to see you again. How's the market treating you?" "Better than expected," Marcus replied smoothly. "As long as you keep pushing that infrastructure bill, we'll be in good shape." The senator laughed, but Marcus's mind drifted. The endless conversations about deals, politics, and money had lost their allure. As he looked around, everything seemed dull. The crowd buzzed with energy, but Marcus felt none of it. It had been this way for years, since Emily died. A ripple of disturbance caught his attention. His gaze landed on a woman standing awkwardly near the buffet table. Her clothes were a patchwork of mismatched layers, and her auburn hair looked tangled and unkempt. She was clearly out of place, eyes wide with discomfort as she hovered near the food. Marcus frowned. Who let her in? Emily Tanner's stomach churned with hunger as she eyed the lavish spread before her. Roasted duck, fresh bread, and fruits she hadn't tasted in months. She hadn't intended to enter the gala, but the warmth and smell of food had drawn her in like a moth to flame. For just a moment, she hoped she could slip in unnoticed and grab a bite. But she'd been wrong. "Excuse me," a voice cut through the chatter, cold and commanding. Emily turned to see a tall man with sharp features and cold, blue eyes approaching her. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, and from the way the crowd parted for him, she knew he was someone important. "What are you doing here?" Marcus asked, his voice low but menacing. I was just," Emily stammered, her heart pounding. "You weren't invited, were you?" His words weren't loud, but the edge in his tone drew attention. People began to glance their way, their curiosity piqued. I'm just hungry," Emily whispered, her cheeks burning with shame. Marcus narrowed his eyes. "This is a private event. If you need food, there are shelters for that." He gestured to the security guard nearby. "Escort her out." The guard moved toward her, and Emily's breath quickened. "Please wait. I wasn't trying to cause trouble, I don't care," Marcus interrupted, his voice cold as ice. "You don't belong here." The guard gripped Emily's arm and began pulling her toward the exit. Her face flushed with humiliation as she was led out, the weight of the room's stairs pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. As the door closed behind her, Emily felt the sting of tears in her eyes. She had been desperate. Now, she felt utterly invisible, discarded like she was nothing. Emily stumbled down the steps outside the hotel, the cold air hitting her with brutal force. She wrapped her thin coat around her, shivering as the wind whipped through the city streets. She found a spot on the cold stone steps and sank down, hugging her knees to her chest. She shouldn't have gone inside. What had she been thinking? Of course, she didn't belong there. People like Marcus Stanton didn't care about people like her. Her stomach growled painfully, but it wasn't just hunger that made her feel hollow. It was the shame, the crushing realization that she had no place in a world like that. No place anywhere, really. Since her mother's death, she had been drifting, homeless, nameless, with no one to turn to. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away, refusing to cry. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Not here, not now. The city lights glittered around her, mocking her with their brightness. All that wealth, all that power, and here she was, sitting on the cold steps with nowhere to go. "I don't matter to them," she whispered. "I don't matter to anyone." The wind howled, and Emily pulled her coat tighter, trying to make herself as small as possible. Across town, Claire Holden sat in her modest Brooklyn apartment, scrolling through her social media feed. Her desk was cluttered with notes and articles from her latest investigation into corporate corruption, but a new post had caught her eye. A photo from earlier in the evening showed a woman being escorted out of a charity gala, disheveled, thin, and clearly not part of the elite crowd. The caption beneath it described how Marcus Stanton, one of New York's wealthiest businessmen, had publicly humiliated the woman before having her thrown out. Claire's brows furrowed as she clicked through the post. She recognized Marcus Stanton's name. Everyone in New York did. He was ruthless in business, known for his cold demeanor and cutthroat tactics. But this story was different. "Humiliated for being poor," Claire muttered, reading the words aloud. It didn't sit right with her. Something about the story tugged at her gut. She opened her laptop and began researching the woman in the photo. After a few clicks, she found another post from someone who claimed to know the woman's name, Emily Tanner. Claire's fingers flew across the keys as she dug deeper. "Who are you, Emily?" Claire whispered to herself, her journalist instincts buzzing. This wasn't just a story about wealth and power. It was about something deeper, something personal. Claire scribbled a note on her pad. "Find Emily Tanner. Expose Marcus Stanton." She leaned back in her chair, determination settling in. If this was the kind of man Marcus Stanton was, the world needed to know. And if Emily needed help, Claire was going to find her. The following morning, Marcus sat behind his massive desk at Stanton Enterprises, the Manhattan skyline stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city below was alive with activity, but Marcus barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere. His assistant entered, holding a folder. "Sir, about last night?" Marcus glanced up, frowning. "What about it?" "There's some chatter online. A few posts have been circulating about the woman you had removed from the gala. It's gaining attention." Marcus waved her off. "It's nothing. People move on from these things. Let them talk." His assistant hesitated. "Should we issue a statement?" "No," Marcus's voice was sharp. "This will blow over. It always does." But as his assistant left, Marcus leaned back in his chair, the image of Emily's face flashing in his mind. There had been something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite shake. It wasn't just the desperation, but the way she had looked at him, like he was a monster. He clenched his jaw, trying to push the thought away. He had done nothing wrong. She hadn't belonged there. It was that simple. And yet, the guilt gnawed at him. Just a flicker, buried deep, but it was there. For years, Marcus had built his empire by keeping his emotions in check, by controlling every aspect of his life. But now, something was slipping. Something was off. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. The success, the wealth, it was all his. But as he looked down at the bustling streets, he couldn't help but wonder, what had it cost him? The clatter of footsteps echoed through the narrow hallway of the homeless shelter. Claire Holden glanced around, taking in the chipped paint on the walls and the faint smell of soup lingering in the air. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her notepad as she approached the front desk. A volunteer looked up, eyes kind but tired. "Can I help you?" Claire nodded, pulling out her phone to show a picture. I'm looking for this woman. Her name is Emily Tanner. She was seen here a few days ago. The volunteer squinted at the photo, then sighed. Emily comes and goes. It's hard to keep track of everyone. Do you know where I might find her? The volunteer thought for a moment before pointing toward the back. Try the common area. If she's still here, that's where she'll be. Claire thanked her and made her way to the common area, her heart pounding with anticipation. She had to find Emily, not just for the story, but because something about the woman felt personal. As Claire entered the room, her eyes scanned the worn couches and scattered belongings. And there, in the corner, hunched over with her coat pulled tight around her, was Emily. Emily? Claire approached cautiously. Emily looked up, her hazel eyes wide with surprise and fear. Who are you? My name's Claire Holden. I'm a journalist. I read about what happened at the gala. I want to help. Emily narrowed her eyes, immediately defensive. Help? How? By telling the world how pathetic I am? No thanks. That's not it at all. Claire knelt down so she was at eye level with Emily. I'm not here to exploit you. I'm here because I think your story is important. I want to hear what you have to say. Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of her coat. She looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. No one cares what I have to say. I do, Claire said softly. Let me buy you a meal, and we can talk. Please. There was a long pause before Emily slowly nodded. Okay, but just a meal. The air in Marcus Stanton's office was thick with tension. His PR team had gathered, flipping through folders and talking in low, urgent voices. Marcus sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of indifference, though inside, irritation simmered just below the surface. The incident at the gala is all over social media now, one of his PR reps said. There's a lot of backlash about how you handled the situation with the woman, Emily Tanner. Marcus waved a hand dismissively. I told you before, it'll blow over. People move on. The PR rep glanced nervously at her papers. It's gaining traction, and the media isn't letting it go. They're framing it as a story about inequality, about how the wealthy treat the less fortunate. Marcus's jaw tightened. And what do you propose we do? Apologize? An apology could help mitigate the damage, yes, the rep suggested carefully. I'm not apologizing for enforcing basic security measures at an exclusive event, Marcus snapped. She shouldn't have been there. Sir, this could affect public perception of you and Stanton Enterprises. Investors may start to question. I don't care what the investors think. Marcus slammed his fist on the table, silencing the room. His chest heaved with frustration. I built this company. I'm not going to let some viral post tear it down. The PR team exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to proceed. Marcus stood abruptly, dismissing them with a curt nod. That's enough. I'll handle this my way. As the room emptied, Marcus sank back into his chair, rubbing his temples. He couldn't let this incident unravel everything he had worked for. He wouldn't. But as he stared out at the Manhattan skyline, the image of Emily's face, desperate, humiliated, flashed in his mind again. And for a brief moment, doubt crept in. At a small, quiet diner on the Lower East Side, Claire sat across from Emily, watching as the young woman picked at her food. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a sterile glow on the worn vinyl booths. How did you end up at the gala? Claire asked gently, breaking the silence. Emily sighed, pushing her food around her plate. I didn't plan it. I was just hungry. It was cold outside, and I thought maybe I could sneak in, get something to eat. But then that man, Marcus, he saw me. And her voice trailed off. I know, Claire said softly. But that's not what I'm asking. I want to know about you. How did you end up here? On the streets? Emily hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. I don't really know, she admitted. My mom died when I was young. I was in and out of foster homes after that. It's all kind of a blur. I've been on my own since I was a teenager. Claire frowned, sensing that there was more to Emily's story than she was letting on. What about your father? Emily shook her head. Never knew him. My mom didn't talk about him much. Just said he wasn't around. Claire's mind raced. There was something about Emily, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. But she knew one thing for sure. This woman's past was far more complicated than it seemed. Do you remember anything about your family? Claire pressed. Anything at all? Emily bit her lip, thinking for a moment. I remember my mom used to tell me that we had a better life once, that we were part of something bigger. But that all fell apart when my dad left. Claire's heart skipped a beat. Emily, what was your mother's name? Rose, Emily replied, her voice distant. Rose Tanner. Claire scribbled the name in her notebook, her mind racing with possibilities. She had a feeling this was just the beginning. Marcus stood at the window of his penthouse, a glass of scotch in his hand, staring out at the city lights. The room was dark, the only illumination coming from the distant glow of the skyline. He swirled the drink in his glass, his thoughts tangled in a web of guilt and anger. He had built his empire through ruthlessness, never stopping to consider the cost. But now, for the first time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the media fallout. It wasn't even the public's judgment. It was that woman, Emily. The way she had looked at him, like he had taken something from her, like he had hurt her. Marcus's mind drifted to his brother, Jonathan, who had disappeared years ago. Jonathan had always been the idealist, the one who cared about people, who wanted to make the world a better place. Marcus had mocked him for it, told him it was naive to think that way. But now, standing in his cold, empty penthouse, Marcus wondered if Jonathan had been right all along. He took a long sip of his drink, the bitterness burning down his throat. Jonathan had abandoned the family, left Marcus to take over the business and the fortune. Marcus had done what he had to do. He had succeeded. But at what cost? Marcus set the glass down and rubbed his eyes, trying to push the thoughts away. He couldn't afford to dwell on the past. He had an empire to protect. But as he turned to head to bed, the gnawing doubt followed him. Later that night, Claire sat at her desk in her small Brooklyn apartment, surrounded by files and papers. The name, Rose Tanner, was scrawled across her notepad, circled several times. She had been digging through public records for hours, trying to find any connection between Rose and Emily's past. Finally, she hit on something, a birth certificate. Rose Tanner had given birth to a daughter. But it wasn't the name that caught Claire's attention. It was the father's name. Her eyes widened as she read it again. Jonathan Stanton. Claire's heart raced as she pieced it together. Emily Tanner wasn't just a homeless woman. She was the daughter of Jonathan Stanton, Marcus Stanton's long-lost brother. This was more than a story about a billionaire humiliating a poor woman. This was about family, about legacy, and the consequences were going to be bigger than any of them could have imagined. Claire stared at the birth certificate in disbelief. She had to tell Emily. But more than that, she had to confront Marcus. He needed to know who Emily really was, and how much of their past was about to come crashing down around them. With her heart pounding, Claire picked up her phone and dialed Emily's number. Emily, I found something. You need to hear this. Claire stormed into the towering office building of Stanton Enterprises, the sleek glass reflecting the city's chaos. She marched through the lobby, her heart pounding in her chest, her determination fueling every step. As she neared Marcus Stanton's office, her grip tightened on the folder in her hand. Inside was the birth certificate that would change everything. Marcus's assistant looked up in surprise as Claire burst into the executive suite. I'm sorry, do you have an appointment? No, Claire said sharply, but he's going to want to hear what I have to say. Before the assistant could stop her, Claire pushed open the door to Marcus's office. Marcus stood by the window, staring out over the Manhattan skyline, his usual aura of control radiating from him. But as Claire entered, his calm demeanor faltered. He turned slowly, raising an eyebrow. Miss Holden, he said coldly, to what do I owe the pleasure? You and I need to talk, Claire replied, her voice firm. She tossed the folder onto his desk, the contents spilling out, documents, photographs, evidence of a past Marcus had thought long buried. Marcus frowned and stepped toward his desk, flipping through the papers with growing confusion. What is this? That, Claire said, is the truth. Emily Tanner is your niece, Marcus. Her father was Jonathan Stanton, your brother. Marcus's face paled as the words sank in. He stared at the papers in disbelief, his hands shaking slightly as he processed the revelation. This can't be true. It is, Claire insisted. Your brother didn't just disappear. He left everything behind, including his daughter. And now, thanks to you, Emily's been living on the streets, completely unaware of her family and her inheritance. Marcus shook his head, his voice low and disbelieving. I didn't know. You didn't care, Claire shot back, her frustration boiling over. You built your empire by abandoning the people who mattered most. You destroyed Jonathan's life, and now Emily's paying the price. The weight of Claire's accusation hung in the air. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the foundation of his carefully constructed life begin to crumble. He had spent years ignoring the past, believing he had moved beyond it. But now the truth was staring him in the face, and there was no way to escape it. Get out, Marcus muttered, his voice trembling. Claire stood her ground. You don't get to avoid this. Emily deserves answers. And whether you like it or not, you're going to have to face what you did. Without another word, Claire turned and left the office, leaving Marcus alone with the weight of his guilt and the truth he could no longer deny. That night, Marcus sat in his dark penthouse, a glass of whiskey clutched tightly in his hand. The city's lights glittered outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely noticed them. All he could see was the evidence Claire had left behind. The photographs, the documents, the undeniable proof that Emily was his niece. He took a long drink, trying to drown the emotions rising inside him. Anger, guilt, fear. They swirled together, threatening to overwhelm him. How had he not known? How had he allowed this to happen? Marcus clenched his jaw, his mind drifting back to Jonathan. His older brother had been the idealist, the one who had always believed in doing the right thing. They had argued so many times. Jonathan wanted to give away their wealth, to live a life of simplicity and service. But Marcus had refused. He had built something real, something powerful. He had protected the family legacy. At least, that's what he had told himself. But now, with the truth laid bare, Marcus couldn't hide from the reality of what he had done. He had pushed Jonathan away, destroyed his dreams, and now Jonathan's daughter, his own flesh and blood, had suffered for it. He slammed the glass down on the table, the sound echoing through the empty apartment. It wasn't supposed to be this way. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. Damn it, Jonathan, Marcus whispered into the silence, his voice cracking. Why didn't you tell me? The guilt weighed heavier with each passing moment, and for the first time in years, Marcus Stanton felt powerless. In Claire's small Brooklyn apartment, Emily sat across from her, clutching a mug of tea in trembling hands. The room was dimly lit, the soft hum of the city outside the only sound as Claire prepared herself to reveal what she had discovered. I know this is going to be hard to hear, Claire began, her voice gentle, but you need to know the truth about who you are, Emily. Emily frowned, her heart racing. What do you mean? I don't have anyone. You do, Claire said, her eyes meeting Emily's with a deep sadness. Your father was Jonathan Stanton. He was Marcus Stanton's brother. The mug slipped from Emily's hands, clattering onto the table as her eyes widened in shock. What? No, that can't be right. I don't even know him. I know, Claire said softly, reaching out to take Emily's hand. Your father left the Stanton family years ago. He gave up everything, the wealth, the name, to live a simpler life. That's when he met your mother. Emily's breath came in short, uneven gasps as she tried to process the news. You're telling me I'm related to Marcus Stanton? That man? Claire nodded, her heart aching for Emily. Yes, I found the documents. There's no doubt. Jonathan Stanton was your father. Emily stood abruptly, pacing the small apartment as tears welled in her eyes. No, this can't be real. I've been alone my whole life. No one ever told me. Her voice broke, and she collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Why didn't anyone tell me? Claire knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. I don't know, but I do know one thing. You deserve to confront Marcus. You deserve answers. Emily looked up, her eyes red and filled with pain. I don't want anything from him. I don't want his money, his name, nothing. But I do want to know why he didn't care. Why he let me live like this. Claire nodded. Then we'll confront him together. You don't have to do this alone. The Stanton family mansion loomed large and foreboding as Marcus arrived. The old estate, nestled in the quiet countryside upstate, was a stark contrast to the sleek, modern buildings he now called home. This place was filled with memories, some comforting, most painful. He hadn't been back here in years, but after Claire's visit, he needed answers. Answers he could only find in the family archives that had been sealed for decades. Marcus walked through the dusty halls, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He made his way to the study, a room he hadn't entered since his father's death. The heavy oak door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing shelves lined with books and boxes filled with old documents. He began searching, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled out files and letters. Jonathan's name appeared again and again in the correspondence, but none of it gave him the answers he was looking for, until he found a letter, tucked away in the back of a drawer. The envelope was old, the paper yellowed with age. It was addressed to his father, from Jonathan. Marcus's heart pounded as he unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Jonathan had written it before he disappeared. Father, I know Marcus will never understand why I'm doing this. He's always been focused on the business, on the family legacy. But I can't live this life anymore. I can't be part of something built on betrayal. I'm leaving everything behind. The money, the power, the name. I have to find my own path, away from the shadows of the Stantons. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope, one day, Marcus will find peace with his choices. Because I never will. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as he read the final line. He had always believed Jonathan had left because he was weak, because he couldn't handle the responsibility of being a Stanton. But now he saw the truth. Jonathan hadn't left because he was running away. He had left because Marcus had betrayed him. The realization hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. His brother's life had been destroyed because of the choices he had made. And now, that betrayal had come full circle, with Emily. Back in Brooklyn, Emily sat at Claire's kitchen table, staring at the envelope in front of her. Inside was a letter from Marcus. He had written to her, asking for a meeting, asking for forgiveness. Claire sat across from her, watching her carefully. What do you want to do? Emily hesitated, her emotions swirling. She had spent years feeling abandoned, feeling like she didn't belong anywhere. And now, here was this man, this stranger, claiming to be her uncle, asking for a chance to make things right. I don't know, Emily admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Part of me wants to just walk away. Forget all of this. But, Claire asked gently. Emily looked up, her eyes filled with determination. But I need to know why. Why he let this happen. Why no one ever told me. Claire nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Then we'll meet him. Together. Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. Okay, let's do this. As they prepared to meet Marcus, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change forever, one way or another. The Stanton family mansion loomed ominously in the distance as Emily, accompanied by Claire, approached its grand iron gates. The sprawling estate was beautiful yet cold, a relic of the wealth that had been denied to Emily her entire life. Claire glanced at her, giving her a reassuring nod. You don't have to do this if you're not ready, Claire said gently. Emily shook her head. No, I need answers. I've spent too long wondering why my life turned out this way. If Marcus Stanton has those answers, I'm going to get them. They stepped through the open gates and walked up the winding drive. Marcus was waiting inside, standing in the dark-paneled study with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the expansive garden. His expression was hard to read, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Thank you for coming, Marcus said, his voice measured. Emily's jaw clenched. I'm not here for pleasantries. I want to know why my father walked away from all of this. Why my mother and I were left with nothing while you got to live like this. Marcus sighed, gesturing for them to sit. It's complicated. Complicated? Emily snapped, the anger she had suppressed for so long bubbling to the surface. It's not complicated to me. My father disappeared. My mother struggled to keep us alive, and I've spent years on the streets. And you call that complicated? Marcus rubbed his temples, his carefully composed facade beginning to crack. I didn't know, Emily. I didn't know you existed. If you had known, would you have done anything different? Claire interjected, her eyes piercing. Or would you have continued living your life while your brother's daughter suffered? The silence in the room was suffocating. Marcus didn't answer right away, and the weight of his guilt was evident in his hesitation. As the confrontation continued, Claire's investigative instincts kicked in. She began scanning the room, her eyes landing on a stack of old papers on Marcus's desk. Something about the documents caught her attention. She walked over to the desk, her fingers skimming the edges of a yellowed envelope. "May I?" she asked, already pulling the letter from the pile. Marcus didn't stop her. Claire unfolded the letter, her eyes narrowing as she read the words scrawled across the page. "It's from Jonathan," Claire said, her voice hushed. "This letter, it explains everything." Emily leaned forward, her heart racing. "What does it say?" Claire hesitated before reading aloud. "Father, I can no longer be part of this family. Marcus has made it clear that he values wealth over humanity, and I cannot live with the decisions we've made. I'm leaving everything behind. Don't try to find me. I hope, one day, Marcus understands what he's done." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "So," Marcus forced him out. Marcus stepped forward, his expression one of deep regret. "That's not how it happened. Jonathan and I had different visions for the family. He wanted to give everything away, to live in some idealistic fantasy world. I did what I had to do to keep the business alive." "You betrayed him," Emily whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "You destroyed our family for money." Marcus's silence was all the confirmation she needed. Later that evening, Marcus sat alone in his penthouse, his hands trembling as he stared into the distance. The confrontation at the mansion had shaken him to his core. For years, he had justified his actions, telling himself that he had protected the family, that he had done what was necessary to survive. But now, the truth was laid bare. He had betrayed his brother, and in doing so, he had condemned Emily to a life of suffering, a life she never should have had to endure. Marcus's chest tightened, a wave of emotion crashing over him. He had spent his entire life building an empire, but at what cost? His brother was gone, and the niece he never knew existed hated him. He stumbled toward the window, the city lights blurring as tears filled his eyes. He had always prided himself on his strength, his ability to remain unaffected by emotions. But now, as he stood on the brink of collapse, Marcus realized just how fragile he truly was. With a shaky breath, he sank to the floor, his head in his hands. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, threatening to crush him. For the first time in years, Marcus Stanton felt utterly powerless. Meanwhile, back at Claire's apartment in Brooklyn, Emily sat curled up on the couch, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was still reeling from the revelations at the mansion. The idea that her father had been betrayed by his own brother was almost too much to bear. Claire sat beside her, offering a comforting presence. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way." "I don't know what to do," Emily whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "I've spent my whole life thinking my father abandoned me. But now I know it was Marcus all along." Claire placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to forgive him, but you deserve to know the full story. And maybe Marcus needs to confront what he's done." Emily nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was ready for that. I thought I was alone for so long. And now, all of this." She glanced at Claire, her expression softening. "But at least I have you." Claire smiled, her eyes warm. "You're not alone anymore. We'll figure this out. Together." The next morning, Marcus sat in his office, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. He had spent hours agonizing over his mistakes, over the life he had taken from Emily without even realizing it. The guilt was overwhelming, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let things end like this. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling as he dialed Claire's number. "Claire, it's Marcus," he said when she answered. I need to see Emily." Please. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Claire spoke. Why? Because I owe her more than just an apology, Marcus replied, his voice thick with emotion. I owe her the truth, and I owe her a chance to decide what happens next. Claire was silent for a moment, but eventually, she sighed. I'll talk to her, but no promises. Thank you, Marcus said quietly before hanging up. As he leaned back in his chair, Marcus knew that whatever happened next, it would be up to Emily. He had lost control of the situation, and for once, he was willing to accept that. He just hoped it wasn't too late to make things right. The small cafe in downtown Manhattan was quiet, a far cry from the grandeur of Marcus Stanton's usual haunts. Marcus sat at a corner table, his fingers tapping nervously on the polished surface. He hadn't felt this kind of unease in years. The door jingled as Emily and Claire entered. Marcus stood, forcing a smile, but it quickly faded as Emily's eyes met his. There was no warmth there, only a steely determination. Claire gave him a small nod, but she too remained guarded. Thank you for coming, Marcus said quietly, motioning for them to sit. Emily didn't speak right away, sliding into the chair across from him with a sense of finality. We're here because Claire said you had something to say, Emily said, her voice flat. So say it. Marcus cleared his throat, the words sticking in his throat. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say 100 times, but now, face to face with the niece he had wronged, it all felt inadequate. I owe you an apology, Marcus began, his voice faltering slightly. I didn't know who you were when I humiliated you at the gala, but even if I had, that doesn't excuse how I treated you. Emily cut him off, her eyes narrowing. Do you really think an apology can fix this? Marcus swallowed, guilt washing over him. No, I don't, but I need you to know that I'm trying. I've spent my whole life making decisions that hurt people, including my brother, your father, and I'm ready to face the consequences. Emily's expression softened slightly, but the hurt remained. You're trying to make amends now? After all these years? Marcus nodded. Yes, I know it's too late to undo the damage, but I want to try. For you. For Jonathan. Emily leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. She studied Marcus for a long moment, weighing his words. Why now? She finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why do you care now? Marcus looked down, his voice thick with emotion. Because I've lost too much, and I don't want to lose you too. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his office, staring out over the city. The second meeting with Emily had been tense, but it had been the first real step towards something he never thought he'd have, a chance at redemption. He had spent years building walls around himself, protecting his empire, his image. Now, for the first time, he was willing to tear those walls down. With a deep breath, Marcus picked up the phone and dialed his attorney. John, it's Marcus. I need you to draw up some documents. I'm transferring a portion of the Stanton fortune, Jonathan's share, to Emily. The silence on the other end was palpable. Marcus, are you sure? Yes, Marcus said firmly. It belongs to her. It always did. When he hung up, Marcus felt a strange sense of relief, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. For so long, he had clung to his wealth, believing it was the only thing that defined him. But now, he realized, it was the very thing that had destroyed his family. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He had taken the first step. Now, it was up to Emily to decide what came next. In her Brooklyn apartment, Claire sat across from Emily, her laptop open on the cluttered table between them. The room was filled with the quiet hum of the city outside, but Claire's focus was entirely on her sister. So, what are you going to do? Claire asked, her eyes scanning the legal documents Marcus had sent over. This is a lot of money. Emily stared at the papers, her mind racing. The offer was generous, more than generous. It was a share of the Stanton fortune that would change her life forever. But it felt wrong. I don't know, Emily admitted. It feels like he's just trying to buy my forgiveness. Claire nodded thoughtfully. Maybe, but I think this is more than that. He's trying to make amends the only way he knows how. Emily sighed, leaning back in her chair. But it doesn't change what happened. It doesn't bring back my father, or the years I lost living on the streets? No, it doesn't, Claire agreed. But it gives you a chance to build something new, to take control of your future. Emily glanced at her sister, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. What would you do? Claire smiled softly. This isn't about what I would do. This is about you. You deserve to live your life on your terms, whether you take the money or not. Emily nodded slowly, her mind still swirling with uncertainty. She had spent so long feeling powerless, adrift in a world that had rejected her. Now, she had a choice. A real choice. A few days later, Marcus stood at the grand entrance of the Stanton family mansion, looking out over the sprawling estate. The air was crisp, and the early morning sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the lawn. He had spent his life here, surrounded by wealth and power, but it no longer felt like home. He had made his decision. As Marcus walked through the halls, the portraits of his ancestors watching silently, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had called a meeting with the board of Stanton Enterprises, and today, he would announce his resignation. He was stepping down, leaving the company in the hands of someone new. Emily. When he reached the study, the board members were already seated around the large oak table, their expressions a mixture of confusion and concern. Marcus took his place at the head of the table, his gaze steady. I've called this meeting to inform you that I am stepping down as CEO of Stanton Enterprises, Marcus said, his voice calm and resolute. Effective immediately. The room erupted in whispers, the board members exchanging shocked glances. But, sir, one of them began, but Marcus held up a hand to silence him. This decision is final. I've spent my life building this company, but it's time for me to step aside. The Stanton legacy belongs to someone else now. He looked down at the papers in front of him, his signature already scrawled across the bottom. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like he was doing the right thing. That afternoon, Emily stood outside the gates of the Stanton family mansion, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of the decision she had to make pressed down on her like a physical burden. Marcus had given her control of the Stanton empire, handed her the very thing that had destroyed her father. But could she accept it? As she stepped through the gates and made her way up the drive, Emily's mind raced. This wasn't just about money. It was about power, about legacy, about everything her father had fought against. When she reached the front door, Marcus was waiting. He looked different, smaller, somehow, as though the weight of his past had finally caught up with him. I wanted to give you a choice, Marcus said softly, his voice tinged with regret. This company, it's yours if you want it. But if you don't, I understand. Emily stared at him, her heart torn. She had spent so long hating Marcus, blaming him for everything that had gone wrong in her life. But now, as she stood before him, she saw something she hadn't expected: vulnerability. I don't want your company, Emily said quietly, her voice steady. But I appreciate what you're trying to do. I think I'm ready to forgive you. Marcus's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. You mean that? Emily nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Yes, but that doesn't mean I'm taking the company. I'm going to build my own life, on my own terms. Marcus nodded slowly, the relief washing over him like a wave. I understand, and I'll support you, whatever you choose. As Emily turned to leave, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in her life, she was free from the past, from the legacy that had haunted her family for so long. And as she walked away from the mansion, the future stretched out before her, full of possibility. The sound of typing and quiet conversations filled the modest office Marcus had rented in a Brooklyn neighborhood. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, giving the space a warmth that felt foreign but welcome to him. Gone were the towering glass walls of Stanton Enterprises. Instead, this office was filled with secondhand furniture, scattered paperwork, and a team of volunteers dedicated to the cause of helping the homeless. Marcus glanced up from his desk, watching as a young woman handed out pamphlets to passers-by on the street outside. The people here didn't know him as Marcus Stanton, the ruthless billionaire. They knew him as someone trying to make a difference, a man who had spent decades disconnected from the struggles of ordinary people, but was now determined to give back. "Mr. Stanton?" A voice interrupted his thoughts. Marcus turned to see one of the volunteers standing by his desk, a clipboard in hand. "Marcus," he corrected with a small smile. "We're all on the same level here." The young man nodded, a little sheepishly. "Marcus, I just wanted to go over the plans for the next food drive. I think we've got everything in place, but we could use more volunteers." Marcus nodded, already feeling the shift in his purpose. "I'll reach out to some people. Don't worry. We'll make it happen." As the volunteer walked away, Marcus leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known in years. This work wasn't about power or profit. It was about giving back to the people he had once turned a blind eye to, people like Emily. He had failed her in so many ways, but now, maybe he could do something good for others. The phone on his desk rang, pulling him out of his reverie. Marcus hesitated for a moment before answering. "Marcus Stanton," he said. "Marcus, it's Emily." His heart skipped a beat at the sound of her voice. It was the first time she had reached out since their last meeting. "Emily," he said, keeping his tone even. "How are you?" "I'm okay," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "I wanted to talk to you. Can we meet?" Marcus's heart pounded. "Of course. Whenever you're ready." Emily stood in the center of her new apartment, a small but cozy space in the heart of the city. The walls were bare, and the furniture was minimal, but it was hers, a place she could finally call her own. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of stability, of control over her life. No more shelters, no more uncertainty. She had started working at a local community center, helping people who had been in the same position she once was. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't easy, but it was fulfilling. She had found a way to use her experiences to help others, and that gave her a sense of purpose she had never known before. As she unpacked a box of books, her phone buzzed with a message from Claire. "How's the new place? Need any help?" Emily smiled at the text, her relationship with Claire growing stronger with each passing day. She had never imagined having a sister, but now that she knew the truth, she couldn't imagine her life without Claire. They had shared so much, their bond deepening as they navigated the fallout of their shared family history. "It's great," Emily replied. "I think I've finally settled in." She put down the phone and looked around the apartment, feeling a sense of pride. She had made it through the darkest parts of her life and come out stronger. She was no longer defined by the Stanton name or by the pain of her past. She was Emily Tanner, and she was ready to live life on her own terms. Claire sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her as she scanned through the latest documents for her newest investigative piece. Her work had taken on a new focus since the events with Marcus and Emily. She was determined to expose the hidden corruption in the city's wealthiest families. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it to see a message from Emily. "Want to grab lunch later?" Claire smiled. Despite their heavy past, the two had found moments of normalcy together, like sisters who had grown up together, not apart. "Sure. I'll meet you at our usual spot." As she returned to her work, Claire couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. She had uncovered the truth about Marcus Stanton, brought justice to Emily, and had found her place in the world, not just as a journalist, but as someone with a family. She no longer felt the distance she had once felt from her past. She had found her identity, and with it, a sense of peace. But she wasn't done yet. There were more stories to uncover, more injustices to expose, and Claire was more than ready to take them on. The park was quiet as Marcus, Emily, and Claire sat together on a bench, the sounds of the city distant and muted. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden light over the trees and the river beyond. "So," Marcus began, his voice hesitant, "how's the new apartment?" Emily glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "It's good. It's nice to finally have my own space." Marcus nodded, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "I'm glad. You deserve that." The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't as uncomfortable as it had been before. There was a sense of understanding, a quiet acceptance of everything that had happened. Claire leaned forward, breaking the silence. "So, what's next for you, Marcus? Now that you've stepped away from the company?" Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm focusing on the foundation. We're doing a lot of work with the homeless community, trying to provide resources for people who have nowhere else to turn. Emily's eyes softened as she looked at him. That's good. I'm glad you're doing something meaningful. Marcus smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. It's the least I can do. For a moment, the three of them sat in silence, watching the river flow by. It wasn't perfect, and it would never be easy, but they had come a long way from where they had started. I'm not expecting forgiveness, Marcus said quietly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. But I want you both to know that I'm trying. I'm going to keep trying. Emily looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, she nodded. I think that's all anyone can ask for. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Emily stood from the bench, brushing off her jeans. I should get going, she said, glancing at Claire and Marcus. But this was nice. Marcus nodded, standing as well. It was. Claire smiled, standing and stretching. Let's make it a regular thing. We're family now, after all. Emily hesitated for a moment before nodding. Yeah, I'd like that. As they began to walk away, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had spent so long running from her past, from the pain and the secrets that had defined her life. But now, as she walked alongside Claire and Marcus, she realized that she didn't have to run anymore. The future was hers to shape, and for the first time, she felt hopeful about what lay ahead. As the three of them left the park, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the city, Emily smiled. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for certain. She was ready for it. And that was enough.